is only a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. This week I have a number of questions from various correspondents that I will try to deal with as well. I have a personal question myself about illness and I'll tell you a little bit about that later on. And also from another correspondent, she was very, very interested in what Titan and maybe other people would have to say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the moment. Not that I particularly want to get into any great politics or anything, but I somehow think that this is all going to rise above politics anyway. I'd be very interested in talking to Titan about that particular conflict. I suppose it's interesting because it has a religious component, but also I suppose in the end it's probably largely just a lot of inhumanity of man against man. So we will talk about that as well. And then I think finally I want to also pick up on a few of the things from last week in terms of near-death experiences and tell you a little bit about the book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that I have just actually finished because there was some quite interesting stuff in there, and a lot of the stuff was echoing very much from what I found out last week, which I'd like to tell you about. So really, without further ado, I'm just going to do what I do every week, which is spend 5 minutes or so getting myself ready here, trying to contact my spirit guide Titan. And again, what seems like a few seconds for you is 5 minutes for me. But that's all it'll be, so I'll see you very shortly. Okay, I think we're ready to go. And Titan is here. It's funny because he's actually telling me that today's episode, in many respects, he says hopefully will be uplifting because he knows what he's going to say. And equally, he wants us to realize that although things at the moment may seem a little bit grim and a little bit desperate, particularly in the area that I mentioned of Israel and Palestine and Gaza, he says that there is no point talking really about specifics of any particular conflict. He says that conflict between man and man, we've discussed before in another episode. We talked about war and peace. He told me then, yes, I remember that. He told me then about a collective consciousness group that is made up of, I suppose, entities, as I remember it, of people who were involved in war, but also they were manifestations of all the different yearnings for war or makings of war. It's suddenly the thought of conflict made the reality of conflict real. And as a result of it, there were a range of interdimensional groups that exist through the power of our thought, but also through the power of the thought of many other entities who have a vested interest in what's going on our planet at our particular vibrational level. The vested interest of making sure that, I think I'm paraphrasing here, but I seem to remember it was almost like making sure that we don't, like monkeys, blow up our cage. And Titan is actually saying to me now, he says that it's quite interesting because if you do look at humanity and think of them really as monkeys, which of course I suppose we are descended from, in many ways that may help you understand how the entities in other dimensions view us as, to a certain extent, a rather unevolved level of existence that has a long, long way to go. But Titan is saying that is the purpose. And Titan is saying the purpose. Titan wants to talk quickly about the purpose of life. Okay. He says to me that the whole purpose of human existence is that we're here to gain experience. He says it's like a playground. It's a sandpit. We are here because in our particular level of existence, the dimension that we're living in, the state of our spiritual growth is at a certain point that having a life and gaining experience in a human form, or an animal form for that matter, in this particular form of existence is vital to our spiritual growth. When we move out of our body, which we do at night time or at the moment of our passing, it all becomes very, very clear to us that we are so much more than just this small physical existence. And the world, the purpose of the world becomes far more obvious to us because we remember it. Now, Titan says to me that very simply, the whole purpose of our existence, of everything that we're doing here on Earth, is a chance to gain experience, to learn about love in its widest forms, in terms of compassion, in terms of doing deeds for other people, helping people, developing people. He says that sometimes it's called a spiritual journey, but it's actually just part of growing up. It's one tiny, tiny portion of the almost endless existence that we all have, our consciousness will have and has. And he emphasizes that because most of what's going on is simultaneous. And although we seem to recognize that we're in a life, we are actually simultaneously in many different existences at the same time, and all of them are progressively learning and educating in order to be able to move on and higher up through the different spiritual dimensions. Titan is saying, it's almost a cliche to you, perhaps, to hear about the fact that love is so important. It was probably not such an important thing to me. I felt that. But tell me, Titan, in terms of love, how can we say that there can be any love that's learned in some form of conflict, like a war, or particularly, of course, we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Where is the love in all of that? Titan is saying that war, and particularly war that involves many, many people, a mass event, is something, again, we have talked about in a previous podcast. It's the power of the consciousness of enough people willing something to happen, that it will happen. But as we found out before, there is a check mechanism. There's a series of checks and balances that is involved at a very high level of reality that ensures that we don't go too far, that we don't destroy more than we should be in order to gain experience and knowledge and understanding about the consequences of our actions, and allowing those consequences to change the way humanity operates for the future. He's saying, in terms of the conflict that we're talking about, he says that there are groups of people that he can see and he can talk to. He can mediate between us, if we like, that deal with peace. He says we've already been to an entity, and yes, I remember that. It was almost like a room full of people. And he said, yes, exactly, a room full of people that were energy consciousnesses, but they were also entities that had in their way been involved in the Earth history in some sort of way concerning war. But there is also a whole bunch of collective consciousnesses of people who wish peace. And peace is as strong a motivation as hatred and war. And there have been a lot of good people He's mentioning the word Gandhi. I'd love to talk to Gandhi. I'm not sure we'll be able to. He said no. He said he'll put us in touch with a group consciousness that is presently very involved in making peace. And he said that, if you like, Gandhi is part of that. He is not just the only person. There have been many great peacemakers, he said, like there have been many great warmongers. But this counterbalance is, again, always important between the war and the peace. And at the moment, he says, I think we're interested in talking about peace and the purpose of peace and the purpose of war. And he says that's all part of the human experience. And as tragic as it is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, humans have killed each other on a massive scale in the most grotesque and brutal ways, he says that there are tremendous learnings that have come from these conflicts that have ensured most recently that there hasn't been a world war for a long time. And that perhaps there is a sense amongst the people that we're evolving into a slightly higher form of dimension as a society, where we do care more about our spiritual growth and our spiritual development. And this is part of the journey that we all as individuals have to take, but also the individuals that affect the group consciousness. Okay, I don't want to stop here because I really feel there's so much coming through me, and it's quite hard to actually articulate it. But Titan is going on, and he's saying that in terms of the conflict that's going on in Israel and Palestine, he says this very old conflict, which has been, if you like, he says, presented as both a religious conflict, but also a conflict over land and a conflict over power. But ultimately, he said that it should never be seen as a conflict about religion, because the religions are generally peaceful in their existence, in what they're trying to teach, and generally people go into religion because they're wanting to have peace and a tremendous amount of love. So he says that it's rather superfluous to start talking about religion. In terms of land and in terms of what belongs to who, again, he says this is a totally pointless exercise because the land doesn't belong to us. No land belongs to any human being. He said this earth has been here for millions of years, longer than any human existence has been on this planet. There have been so many other civilizations that have been here, not just in our reality, but also in other layers of reality that we can't necessarily see, that are interacting with us simultaneously. And he says, we've mentioned that before, that across the billions and billions of miles of space, intergalactic space, we are in communication with simultaneously with many beings and many forms of existence. We interact with them, they interact with us. And so we're not alone here on our planet. We are constantly in communication with all forms of higher existences that are influencing the way that we are doing things and are very interested in the progress or non-progress that we're making in terms of elevating our consciousness. And that is the whole point of a human existence, is to go through, he says, pain, through war, through feeling, through physical experience. And these physical experiences are designed to educate us, to change the way that we do things, and to help us move on and to increase our spiritual journey experience. Titan is saying that there are huge amounts of groups with multitudinous people or entities that are pushing for peace. He says you can call them pushing for peace groups if you like. And they are not fearful of war, but they love peace. And they see it as important to push for peace through people as it is for other people to push for war. He says that, unfortunately, human beings being what they are and being so consumed by some of the physical needs that they have, will use religion, will use land, will use all measures that they have at their disposal in order to create war, mainly because they're frightened. They tend to be frightened and they fear something tremendous that they just can't understand. For them to accept peace is what is necessary. He says what has happened in society, in human society over the years, is that we've set around ourselves a fence, a wall, and it's filled with rules and social structures that allow things to happen in only a certain way. But he says that part of our spiritual development is to break these down and to allow our natural development of the individual, to allow for the freedom to do things in a different way, to allow the freedom of making peace. He says that I mentioned Gandhi as an example of someone who prayed for peace and non-violence. I remember that. He says, yes, but that is the ultimate goal, is that people must understand that by killing and by murdering people, by using religion as an excuse to do that, by using the pursuit of possessions and land, all of that is just a blockage that's keeping the love of peace away from us. Okay, so what can we do, Titan? What can we do to change the way that we are as a species in order to allow this natural development of our individuality? Titan says that we either see the world as a playground or we see it as a war ground. It's completely our choice. And he said at any point in human history, the choices have been there for us to be able to choose war or choose peace. And we've had huge amounts of war. We've had decades of peace. We've had some wonderful actions that have happened in our societies. But at the moment, as we discussed in the previous podcast, there's an awful lot of thinking of war. And this creates a very strong reality that war takes place and materializes into conflict. And said we need to just as much concentrate on peace and push for peace and to dream of peace and see the benefits of peace. And he says that he says that one of the members of the peace group, and he says that this group is made up of people who've been involved, as he mentioned, yes, in terms of life and in other realities, have been intricately involved in conflicts and solving them and helping humanity overcome these things. One of the best things that we could do is to try to think of ways that human beings can communicate with each other despite these artificial constructs that make us go to war, such as religion, or wanting land, or possessions, or tradition, these fences that we put around us. He says the way to move forward and the way for us to get the spiritual love and experience that we need is to give that a chance. He says that an example of that might be that if you were a Jewish person, you may at this particular time of Ramadan in the Muslim calendar invite people who are Muslim to come into your house and to eat with you. Or the Jewish people may well feel that at the moment that there is a lot of hatred towards the Palestinians because of what happened, the terrible things that happened in their country. But equally, if they could also understand the terrible things that have happened to the Palestinians in their country, and they are happening to them as well. If we could meet together and meet as minds without all the hatred, without all the retribution, without all the, and he's saying this now, this eye for an eye, and it's this sense that there's always got to be a revenge. He says that is understandable because that is a kind of a balancing act where A does something to B and then B does something to A. However, the whole purpose of life is to understand that there is a greater good to be had if we could use peace as the way to understand each other and to live together. And there's so much more, Titan is saying, that can be achieved as humanity if we work together as a team, he says. If we actually contribute together, if we work together instead of fighting against each other, we will achieve so much more, and achieve so much more in terms of curing all the problems that exist on our planet. And that ultimately is the learning that we are here to have. But he's saying now also, just on an individual note, as one human to another, it needs to start at that level. It needs to start with you and me doing something loving and good for somebody who potentially might be your enemy or you may feel is going to do you harm. It has to start in some simple process. And he's actually showing me now something that I remember seeing when I was a young man. And it was a scene, and I can see it so clearly now. It was a scene, I think, during the First World War, and I think it was real, where one very cold night in the trenches, I think it was around New Year's or something, the German who were fighting the English and the French, they stopped everything. They stopped the fighting. And in fact, I believe somebody brought out a football, and they started kicking around this football in no man's land and had a football match. And it was unbelievable. It was like it showed people how we are all the same. We are all human. There is nothing that's different between us. We're all the same flesh and blood. We just need to kick off these ideologies. We need to kick off this hatred, all these earthly things that are these fences around us. And yes, I think sadly after the football match was ended, they went back to their trenches and then started firing guns at each other again. And as I seem to remember, from the British point of view, I think a number of the troops were court-martialed for doing that because it was considered to be almost treachery and cowardice. I don't know. But how wrong. And in fact, it was completely the opposite. What a wonderful example of man's love for another man. And I'm not a great sports person, but I'm getting this very strongly through. Titan wants to say that there is a lot of discussion about artists and sports people and musicians who are being told that they shouldn't, for instance, play a concert in Israel because it's somehow sanctioning a regime that is causing barbarity against the Palestinians. And Titan is saying it's quite the opposite. This whole thinking that you are somehow bolstering an enemy by showing peace is such a contradiction. See, it's the pure act of creating music and doing something artistic and bringing something from the outside to bring people together is a wonderful example of peace and love. He's saying he understands how difficult it might be for us to understand that. It might be very difficult for us to understand, for instance, that a group of people might be enjoying beautiful music and a beautiful concert, while only a few hundred miles away, people are dying of starvation, hunger, and being bombed. But he said that these musicians should not be criticized for what they're doing, because in their own small way, they are making that step that they can make, because they are musicians. They are people who can get a public following by what they do. And Titan is actually saying to me that this is to be totally and utterly praised and not criticized. He's saying to me the history of humanity has always been that when you actually confront cruelty, when you confront war with overtly peaceful things, It's what changes the whole perception of the war and allows people eventually to see the inhumanity of what both sides are doing to each other and learn from that, and to never try to repeat that again. But he's saying to me also, the sad thing about that, like the wars that we have had and the promises that we've made, to bury the knives and the hatchets, to never have a war again, a war to end all wars, he says. That it's so sad, it doesn't last for very long, because our memories, being human, do not last forever. But he says, for now, let's just deal with the issue that we're here to deal with, and that is the conflicts that are going on in the world. And they can only be cured. The learnings can only be had if we make peace with each other. And we do things through cultural, through sporting, through every means possible, other than guns and bullets. Okay, so thank you, Titan, for that. I think that pretty much answers the question about the wars. The other thing that I wanted to touch upon too, which is something that's very important to me, and I think in a way it relates to war, and I had these thoughts all week long as to, what is the purpose of war? What do we do this for? And I think Titan has answered that question. But I also just wanted to mention a more personal thing, because I want to know something, and it also relates to another one of my correspondents. Personally, I have a daughter who was diagnosed a month or two ago with anorexia nervosa. She's only just turned 13, and she's had an extremely normal childhood, a very middle-class environment to grow up in. No particular reason why this would have happened. And then suddenly, after coming back from New York in the summer, she stopped eating very much. And we just didn't really notice it was getting so bad until Christmas time, when she suddenly was sitting there at Christmas dinner and not eating anything. We eventually took her to see a child doctor, and she was formally diagnosed. And she was even put into a clinic, a residential clinic that we didn't really like, because she hated it there, and she was so sad, and she was so afraid. And really, honestly, I can tell you that, and I'm sure many of you listening to this have known similar experiences, as a parent, you just can't see your daughter go through something like that. So my question, as she slowly recovers at home, is to ask Titan, what is the purpose of this? How can it be right that a 13-year-old girl who has, normal in every possible way, why would there be any form of cosmic purpose in suffering from this disease? And what's the point of it all in terms of choices that we make? Titan is saying to me, look, she is saying, Philip, first of all, it is horrifying what people have to go through when people have diseases. And she says that, you also, I know you wanted to mention one of your correspondents who recently lost her husband to cancer. We've done that in another podcast, she said. We've discussed cancer. But in terms of disease, what learnings are there? Well, the most important thing is that it's part of the development for that child, and it's part of the development for you as a person. The effect of all of this goes far and wide. And she's saying the fact that I'm actually talking about this on a podcast that potentially reaches thousands of people is an important part of the process. It's sharing something, but it's also getting people to be aware of things and perhaps to see things with compassion in a way that they hadn't had before. But also it's about you, she's saying. It's about me learning a new thing. It's about something about my own spiritual development. It's also about my daughter. Yes, she says it is true that we, to a large extent, choose the various things that will happen to us in our lives. And it may seem incomprehensible that a child would decide to be killed in a bombing attack, or to die as a 1 or 2-year-old, or in the case of my daughter, to suffer a really horrifying mental illness that has seemingly struck out of the blue. But she says that these things happen for a purpose. In the purposes of your daughter, a choice was made. For whatever reason, her entity had decided that it needed that experience. That plan went into effect. And that whole experience that she's going through is something that is changing the way that she will live her life, and will ultimately, and she says, I can't tell you too much now, but ultimately the effect that it's having on her will influence greatly the way she leads her life and the things that she'll be doing in her life that will help other people. Titan is also saying that nearly in everyone's experience who's listening to this now, and nearly every human experience, people have had things that have happened to them in their lives that seem to be seemingly random, but they're not. But they can radically change the direction that the life was taking. They choose, if you like, another future. Their road changes and it deviates to another direction. And this direction is something that is crucial to the spiritual development of all people. And that, again, is the purpose of us being here. She's saying that although it is very hard, it's very hard for the parents, it's very hard for the patient, it's very hard, she said, for the hospitals and the doctors and all the people who get involved in all these terrible illnesses that people suffer from as human beings. The wider effect of that is something that can be truly wonderful and can be changing of people's lives. And it's funny you actually mention that, Titan, because my correspondent who was talking to me about the sad death of her husband mentioned that in a way it has brought her group of friends so much closer together. People were drifting apart, but this very sad episode helped bring people together. Yes, Titan is saying that it just seems inconceivable to us in our physical existence and leading the lives that we lead, that these unexpected illnesses and diseases that befall our family and our friends, that cause us so much immediate pain, let alone, of course, the distress to the people who are ill, and particularly, of course, as people die, and sometimes very tragically. But it is an essential part of the human experience. The whole purpose of being here is to go through experiences that will allow us to develop. And we have a whole collection of things that we need to learn. And all the love and the empathy and the understanding is part of this process. As I was saying that, I had this tremendous surge of love that was coming through to me. And I don't know if I can even put into words, but it was trying to explain again why what is happening to my daughter is happening. And it was just, I couldn't even put it into words. It was a tremendous sense of being looked after and being cared for. I felt this envelope of love and knowledge that I can't put into words. But it's showing me, I'm sure, that I mustn't be so afraid, because the purpose of it all, as hard as it is for me to go through and as hard as it is for my family, ultimately it is a plan and it's there for a reason. And hopefully I will see that. Yes, now Titan is saying that. You will see that. You will see this at the end of it. People generally will come out at the other end of the tunnel, if you like, and will look back and will realize that that was a life-changing event. That was a significant thing that allowed them to change the direction of their lives and maybe even influence the way they'll lead the rest of their lives. Titan is saying that it's not just going to be the people who were immediately connected to me or to the lady who lost her husband. It won't even perhaps be necessarily children left behind, or it might not even just be friends or parents who know of that person. It'll be all the other people that these things touch. And it's so much a part of the the human experience that people get the knowledge of this and maybe change the way they think, because it's all about using your mind. It's about the power of your thoughts. And she says, I challenge you, anyone who's been through a tremendous grief or going through the day-to-day dramas of somebody who is incredibly ill and somebody who may die. He said, I challenge you to see anything other than love in these moments. There may be stages of grief, there may be stages of anger and resentment and disbelief, but ultimately it will be resolved by a feeling of love. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I just get myself together a little bit here because it does lead on to last week's episode where we talked about near-death experiences. And one of my correspondents wanted to pick up on that and ask that, when somebody is dying, and obviously that's what happens in a near-death experience, it is usually somebody who's incredibly ill, and generally pretty much dies physically, and the consciousness does separate from the body, although not totally. And then at one point the consciousness returns to the body, and the body then lives. But in those experiences, I was reading in the book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she has done all this studying. She's passed on now, but she did a lot of studying on people who were dying. But she came across a lot of evidence also as a scientist for the reality of life after death because of the very similar experiences of people who came back to life and described the same things happening, such as seeing relatives or seeing pets or people who are familiar to them. Children might see other children, or if they were religious, they might see Jesus, or whichever might be their particular religious persuasion. But what is, of course, most important was that people also heard music, or they heard things that sounded familiar to them. Perhaps you could just say a little bit more about that, Titan. Titan says that we mentioned this before. Obviously, at the point of death, it's an extremely probably frightening and challenging time for everyone. Some people just cannot believe that they have actually passed on. And it is very comforting, obviously, to be able to see people that they feel are their loved ones and are there to meet them or to hear familiar music or see things. So that is pretty much why that happens. Okay, Tyne, I just wanted to also ask you, what about if you're the person left behind and you feel that you don't want to let that person go? What happens next? Now, Titan is saying to me that, and this is something that I have actually mentioned to a few people before, but she's reminding me of this. And again, this is a personal thing. This is a personal situation with me, and it was when my father died. And for a while, I was seeing my father, and it was living in another dream reality with my father and my brother and my mother. And we'd almost seemed to be, when I was in this situation, living as I was as a schoolboy. And I was seeing my father and I was interacting. And as you will know, sometimes dreams appear to be so real. It's not until you wake up that you realize that you were actually in a dream. There is a timelessness about it. And Titan is mentioning to me now, don't forget that there is that reality. She said, your father created that reality. And I said, I realize that. But my story is that, which I think I should tell you, is that over the course of quite a few months of visiting my father in my dreams after he had died and being totally confused as to why my father was there, because I knew my father was dead. I knew he had been cremated and I'd been to his funeral, so I knew he wasn't there. But there he was, as a kind of a younger version of himself and carrying on as if nothing had happened. And eventually the cracks started to show. When I felt I was actually trying to say to him, I'm sorry, you're not my father. You have died. And I think the other people around were also questioning this. And eventually I think my father must have seen this, and I stopped having these dreams. And again, it wasn't again for quite a long time later that I was actually back in touch with my father, who actually arranged to meet me. And we sat there in this amazing sort of place that I just had to will to be there, and I was there. It was like a massive sort of stadium, and I arrived at this particular table where people were sitting and talking, and food and drinks, our favorite food and drinks were already there waiting for us. And all of this seemed to happen in such an automatic way. And he was sitting there, but he didn't look like my father. He looked a different person. And he explained that he wasn't my father per se. He was a collective entity, that part of it was my father. And he told me a lot of personal things that I don't need to go into here concerning my family. But more importantly, he just told me something that I'll never forget. And I'm very glad that I actually had the chance to hear that and to be with him. And he told me that he's had so many existences. He had so many children. He had so many wives and family. Countless. That it's very hard once you have passed on and you've started moving further up to remember or to even be particularly concerned with people who are alive. He said that is not meant to insult the people who are left behind or make them feel bad. It's just that it's so obvious when you pass on that you know so many people, and the people left behind on earth are just a fraction of the enormity of your entity and the relationships that you have. So it takes a huge amount of energy, he told me, to make contact. And generally, he told me that it's easier to do it through something like a spirit guide. But eventually, of course, people on Earth also forget. They forget too, and the link is broken over a period of time. Now, in terms of people left behind, like my mother or other people, the people who've been corresponding with me, I think they find it truly sad that their loved one passes and they don't want to let go. But my father told me, and I think this is why Titan is saying it to me, is that it is incredibly important at one point to let go, because you cannot spend your whole life in grief. And, I had to let go of my father, and I honestly don't really have much to do with him anymore. Very rarely do I see him in some sort of environment, some sort of dream, but very rarely. But I can feel him always. And I know that all my father's love is there. But he's moved on, and as he should, and I've moved on, and that is the nature of life. So yes, it is very hard to let someone go, but you have to let them go for their own good as well as yours. As hard as that is to say, or I should say how easy it is to say, but how hard it is to actually to live that. So before we finish today, Titan does want to say something more about life. Titan is saying that while we're alive, we really have to try to live the life that we can. We will go through so many experiences, good things and bad things, challenging things. Many of these things have been planned for us to go through. A number of them are choices that we make in human form through our actions. So we're not completely tied to a particular road. But as sad as it can be, we must embrace all the learning that we can get from these events, these things that happen to us. And in the terms of people who are close to us who die tragically, we have to try to leave the grief behind and understand what was the purpose. How is that going to change me? How is that going to change my family? How is that going to perhaps advance the cause of finding a cure or my interest in that? Titan says in terms of wars and conflicts, such as the Israel-Palestinian war at the moment. Don't get so consumed by the people who are causing the war. Don't get so consumed by the hate and the anger and the war. Dwell on the peace. Think of the peace. Think peace. Send the positive peace and create peace in your mind. Whenever you see something that is tragic on television, it's not real. It's just a recording of something. It's not really happening. But also think of what is really happening where it's going on, and try to think of peace. Try to think of good things. Try to think of ways that you can perhaps personally help in some way, if you can, in some charitable way. Try to do something more positive to break down these fences that we as humans make, and to build the peace between different societies, different religions. And then we will truly, he says, discover the purpose of life, and we will learn the things that we are here to learn, and we will spiritually develop and move on. Thank you, Titan, and thank you very much for the wonderful messages.